Okay, so when and where were you born?
I was born in Jakarta, Indonesia in 1951.
And did you ever move?
Well, I moved twice, once to Holland when we were kicked out of Indonesia, and then in 1960 moved to Oakland, California.
What was it like growing up there?
Well, I was raised in Oakland during the 1960s, which was probably the most exciting time in this country, and certainly in Oakland, the birthplace of the Black Panthers. I experienced many things during that time. One of the major things was the war in Vietnam. In those days, boys who turned 18 were eligible for the draft. They got an invitation to join the draft, and at that time, given a lottery number, you might be eligible for the draft during that 1 year of eligibility or escape the draft. I was 17 years old in 1969 and contemplating leaving this country as a conscientious objector. I was still a Dutch citizen, and I felt that at that time I shouldn't have to sacrifice my life for a country that I didn't really feel close to at that time. So I was prepared to move. But I was lucky enough that my draft lottery number was high, and I wasn't drafted, and so I went on to college.
If relevant, did you know anyone who served in the Army?
I knew several people who served in the military. They were my co-workers, for one. When I was a college student, many of my co-workers were either drafted or joined the military. Some of my friends as adults were in Vietnam, and they suffered physically. Some even contracted hepatitis. My father was a prisoner of war during World War II, where he was beaten and caged for 3 years while he was building the bridge on the River Kwai, a famous bridge that was eventually blown up by the British. He experienced a lot of brutality and hardships during his 3 years of captivity, and something that had affected him growing up into adulthood and raising his children. I'm sure somehow it affected me.
Okay. Were you scared when any of this was happening?
Well, I mean, when he was prisoner of war, I was not around yet, but the Vietnam War was very scary. I followed the news every day. That's all we saw on TV every day. You know, the news led off with the war in Vietnam. They were keeping track of how many deaths were recorded every day. And it seems to me like the war was really determined by how many deaths each side experienced. And most often the United States had fewer deaths than the Vietnamese. And that supposedly meant that we were winning the war. But, you know, in 1969, 1970, Nixon became president, and he started to withdraw troops from Vietnam, and in a way that, made me happy, because it meant that maybe I was not going to be drafted.
Okay, so if you didn't draft into the Army, were you scared that they were going to come after you?
Well, I mean, I was prepared to go back to Holland, and retain my Dutch citizenship and find success in Holland, because all of my family was still there. We were the only, my parents were the only Tinklenbergs in this country.
So did you move back to Holland, or did you decide to stay here?
Well, I was already a resident for 10 years in this country. I've adopted many of the American ways. In the 1960s, like I said, was a very dynamic period. I was kind of like raised with the Beatles. You know, they came into popularity in '64, and during the 6 years to 1970 that I was growing up as a teenager, they were growing up as a band, and all the different changes that they made, I kind of like changed along with them. And when they broke up in '69, it was really a difficult period because, you know, it meant another change in my life that I had to deal with. And it was, you might not think that breaking up of a band was difficult, but it certainly affected me because it meant that there was no such thing as permanence.
So when you went to college, what college was it, and what did you graduate?
When I was a high school student, my friend and I started a film class in high school, and we made films, social-oriented films, which we examined the war in Vietnam and social consciousness. And I was going to continue as a filmmaker, and USC was the place to go in those days. But I couldn't afford USC, and it was too far away from home, so the next best thing was San Francisco State, and that's where I ended up as a filmmaker.
So, what do you think are like the hardships that you went through throughout those years? Like, what are the main ones that you went through?
Well, up until my parents divorced, somewhere around '65, I was a very strong Catholic. I was an altar boy, served Mass every Sunday, attended Mass, did my confessions on Saturday. So, you know, I was a devout Catholic. And then when my parents divorced, that caused me to lose a lot of faith in God. I didn't understand how a person who's supposed to be just can cause a divorce and put the children in really in a painful situation. So when my father announced that he was leaving my mom, I went to my room, took the cross off of the wall and threw it against the wall. And that was the end of going to church.
Okay, well, I think that's pretty much it. Is there anything you would like to add on for World War II? Is that all?
Well, I mean, war, I was, raised around the idea of war and how unjust it was, and it certainly affects me today, and it also affects, how I interpret history and how I deliver history to my students. I think my students can testify to the fact that I have a very cynical attitude about a lot of things regarding politics and things that are taught in the textbook. And I want them to at least learn from me that everything is worth questioning and that not to take everything or anything at face value. Be aware of propaganda, how advertisement and the news media try to affect or influence your decisions to buy things or to believe things. I think all of that had to do with, being raised in the 1960s where people were always questioning things, and I took that seriously. And whereas many of the 60s radicals have become conservative and Wall Street millionaires, I believed in the ideology of the 60s, and I practice it even today. I got this for you. Top 50 tunes. What you might find interesting is the diversity of the artists and the music. I remember here number 14 was Santana, Evil Ways. I remember sitting on the bench outside at lunchtime with my friends and discussing Santana, and I thought he was never going to be successful. Well, that was my famous last words. Of course, that was the year of Woodstock, and that had a great influence on me. The radio station that became very popular, that really influenced, again, my musical taste and my social awareness was KSAN, the original KSAN with Tom Donahue. And I remember a newscaster named Dave McQueen. I think he's now on CBS or KCBS or something. He's a little bit conservative, but you can still hear him in his voice, his cynicism. And I think whenever he reported about the war in Vietnam and FBI actions, there was a lot of cynicism in his voice. And I still remember that to this day. I remember his voice. So that radio station and Dave McQueen was an influential force. Of course, there was a psychedelic period. Being a good Catholic, I did not engage in drugs until later. Nixon, I was, you would find it strange now, but I was a Nixon supporter only because he was against the war in Vietnam. Edward Kennedy and his incident at Chappaquiddick really disappointed my faith in the Democrats, and I thought that the Democrats were moral people, but that incident with Edward Kennedy was a disappointment. It was the beginning of Sesame Street. I didn't like it then. I thought it was kind of cute now. A movie that was released in 1969 was Easy Rider, one of the greatest movies ever made regarding freedom. The trial of the Chicago 8, because during the Democratic Convention in '68, there was a lot of demonstrations at the convention in Chicago, and a guy named Tom Hayden made his mark in that demonstration, and I thought he represented the new wave of thinking, and later on he married Jane Fonda, and that destroyed my feelings about his ideology. Bell-bottom jeans and tie-dyed shirts. Now, I did wear bell-bottom jeans, but I wore a different kind of shirt. I can't remember what they're called, but they had these little funny designs on them that looked like cells, amoebas. And the Beatles' White Album was released. It was originally called Two Virgins because John and Yoko were on the cover naked, and they felt, she knows about it. Psychedelic. Well, that was not a psychedelic album, but that certainly was an interesting album. And of course, Muhammad Ali was convicted of draft evasion because as a Muslim, he did not want to fight for the war in Vietnam. And I thought he was a bad man, but of course, since then, I have reconsidered that. And he's another hero.
Okay, well, thank you for your time and everything.
Okay, you're welcome. And I think you can make a wonderful board with that information there.
Thank you.
All right?
Very much. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Nice interview.
Okay.